Looking back to the start of the show, there's this air of uncertainty about how it has either aged or become irrelevant to where it stands today. Because these days, there are two camps of people who are fans of the show. Those that say it had potential, and I stopped watching after Volume 3. I had once considered reviewing the show proper, however, that was quickly stopped when I noticed just how devoid the show is of any conflict. So instead of getting into the tapeworms that is the show's plot, I will be diving into the cast and what they have to offer. For consistency, I'll be referring to the show's volumes as seasons, since that is what I'm more comfortable with. With that out of the way, I am going to be brutally honest about these characters and say things that are critical of their writing. If you're uncomfortable with that, feel free to return once you are, or don't. I do not share any similar attachments as you may have. With that cleared up, we may begin with RWBY. The semi-protagonist who shoots blanks, Ruby Rose is the youngest in the cast whose surface traits consist of thirsting over the dubious occupation of huntress, being a weapon geek, and an insatiable desire to be slaying Grimm. Like, her whole dream in existing simply consists of wanting to be a hero like in the books. Being out in the field killing those monsters, even if we are never really given much reason to fear their existence, then that the show tells us we're supposed to. A reason we could understand isn't given, and the later excuse of her mother being one becomes weak when it is given some thought that RWBY never reflects on this. Even if I were to take its 9th season into account, it isn't out at the time of me writing this. It remains ridiculous that it took them 8 seasons to consider the idea that she should reflect on her actions and anything at this rate. Getting too far ahead, but let's go briefly through her main interest throughout the season, making friends. This interest isn't one of her own, but rather something the writers forced upon her with the aid of Yang, her sister, consistently abandoning her on 3 separate occasions. There is mention that RWBY did have friends before enlisting to Beacon, but no impression is given that they ever existed and never get referenced thereafter. RWBY herself initiates 2 other potential friends, Blake and Weiss, who I will go into much later. Attempts to befriend Blake start and end with the mention of books.
I love books.
She never interacts with Blake for another 7 seasons after this. Weiss, on the other hand, has an explosive start, but eventually, Weiss does grow to respect her as the leader. The other friends made are John and some trash can named Penny. Since this is season 1, there isn't much explored with those 2, but will be expanded if and when we get to season 2. Just know that she's on good terms with both, yet a bizarre choice from the writers was not to have RWBY and Glinda interact or have much of any contact since episode 1. Glinda was the first huntress and the only one that we will ever see on screen that could have helped RWBY in later scenes. However, that instead gets relegated to Ozpin. I wouldn't call him a mentor of RWBY, but his words do help her become more confident in leading her team, even if we never witness how she unifies them.
Nope.
On that note, RWBY has no connection to her team as the leader, with the only one character ever putting that into question. Said questioning is swept away rather quickly after a pep talk for both, ending any sense of conflict between RWBY and Weiss. More on that when we get to Weiss. Other students like Ren, Nora, and the walking death flag, Kira, she has no connection to either, which gets weird for future scenes and team-ups that occur unnaturally. For what is supposedly the name of the show in some regard, RWBY is shown not to have much of any conflict whatsoever, which is more so the result of the writers not knowing how to commit.
No? Come on.
The most we get is with the villain Roman, the only decent part of Season 1. But even in that case, the two don't really bounce off of one another as it is one-sided with 2 encounters. More on him later. RWBY in Season 1 is as pure as it gets, with the exception that her gun or weapon love does not transition over to the next season, as the writers couldn't come up with any reason to keep it. With RWBY covered, let's explore her sister, Yang.
Oh my god, you really exploded.
Yang Xiaolong is the tomboy, until she isn't. They are related by sharing the same father but have different mothers, yet were both raised by the same mother. It's not relevant until next season, but I figured I should mention it here before proceeding. Keeping things brief, Yang as an older sister is probably the most active and pure this season as her family relation to RWBY becomes less relevant the further it goes. The time she does spend with her sister when she isn't abandoning her for comedy is genuinely something that functions in Season 1. Granted, any concern for her sister, while shown in, I think, 2 instances, Yang never asks RWBY how she's dealing with life in the academy, studying, food, money, or any other concerns. Beacon itself is bare bones in terms of any facilities outside of the 2 classrooms, a hall, a mess hall, and the dorm. Something strange is that even though Yang was looking forward to going there with her sister, she is just as fast to abandon her, which speaks more on the tonal whiplash of the writers not knowing how to balance their comedy at the time. They still haven't figured that out.
No? Come on.
But we don't really know how Yang performs in her classes outside of the fact she's actually almost faster than her sister, whose power is literally just speed. We don't even get an idea of what it took for her to qualify for getting into the academy. While Yang's maybe that of rage or something until it is later changed to rebounding kinetic energy or something, they never define anything in this show. Credit to Yang actually taking some time to get to know her teammates, something RWBY doesn't attempt in the slightest. Now, there is some time-skipping bullshit because the writers didn't like the idea of having a calendar and a clock, but that's no excuse not to at least explore how the characters interact with one another. You know, the bare fucking minimum of storytelling, and they couldn't even achieve that. Yang has more traits to befit her as the leader compared to RWBY, who doesn't even try to learn how to lead, something I imagine would have been a better conflict than the
Why don't you go try and make some friends of your own? But why would I need friends when I have you?
attitude she has and drops quickly. You'd think Yang would at least try talking to her sister about becoming the leader, having either opposition or anything congratulatory. She, along with Blake, just accept their circumstances with RWBY being selected as leader. Come to think of it, the very premise of teams aren't really tested in tangible terms, since no one really communicates with one another and how to coordinate. Even looking at the supposed fight scene with the big bird and Scorpion, the writers wrote them running away from the fight only to proceed fighting them head on. Otherwise, everyone, aside from the other team, aren't communicating with how to attack the threat. Yang just pelts the bird with some Tic Tacs, which doesn't leave much of an impression or any impact, really putting into question the usefulness of their tools, which the only thing that seems to work is with blades rather than bullets. Even looking at Yang's own weapons, I question how the hell her arms are still connected, since she is basically unloading the equivalent of shotguns from her arms. Given her weight and age, she should not have any function within her arms and hands. RWBY at least has the excuse that her weapon is not directly attached to her body, even if her shoulders would probably be broken from basic use. But ultimately, Yang exists as a sort of mother figure to RWBY, who is uncomfortable in her new environment, with an abandonment issue that follows Yang for the rest of the series. A positive thing, at least, is that Yang is probably at her most tolerable this season than she is later, because of both being solely based off her actress and a meta element that should have never entered the show. So even if Yang goes without much conflict, let's talk about the one character who caused the majority of it, Blake.
Unfortunately, the real world isn't the same as a fairy tale.
I don't think I'll lose many people when I say Blake is easily the worst character in this series to ever exist. I say this because she is given so much screen time while being the least developed concept for a character, since all she is used for is to vomit exposition to the audience which informs little of her character. Because all of it is propaganda being thrust upon the audience with no confidence from the writers to trust their audience. Blake herself does not constitute the basic necessities to be a character, since she is the writer's megaphone for the civil rights movement. A problem? any uneducated individual will immediately notice is that we don't see the discrimination toward her race, if you could even call it that. We see bullying once, a mention from one of the teachers about heritage before it's quickly moved on, and what I can only describe to be one of the worst backstories I've seen from this show. There are worse ones in the show, but it is rather obvious that the writing team had no idea what the fuck they were going to do with her character. While she does resemble the worst aspects of Beauty and the Beast, in a backward sense, she is responsible for a vast majority of turmoil within the show, especially considering how little they demonstrate any suffering or conflict with her or any characters for that matter. By simply abandoning Adam and being a brainwashed tool, which in retrospect doesn't make sense, she's responsible for the worst that has yet to come. Interestingly, she does have a foil until they throw it in the trash. So the character Weiss is the only person to ever challenge her story about the Faunus being discriminated or in some manner of suffering. Like, for real, everything Weiss says about the White Fang is true with them being criminals, since they were acting against the law, disrupting the peace, as evident when they are seen working with Roman. Meanwhile, she simply tries to defend this as
They're a collection of misguided faunus.
Misguided?
for real. Weiss is 100% correct in what she says when saying,
You realize you're defending an organization that hates humanity, don't you? The faunus of the White Fang are pure evil.
knowing how to argue effectively, might I add. It gets dumber when Blake tries to shift the blame of humanity solely on Weiss and some tool nobody remembers. There is also something tangible with why Weiss is biased toward the Faunus and how they've made her family suffer, causing an unsavory upbringing. So, how does Blake respond?
Well, maybe we were just tired of being pushed around.
And runs away having said it. Like, that is her basic instinct when something challenges her. She just flees any responsibility or accountability. Blake befriends in her escape one of the better supporting cast members, Sun. I don't have anything to say about him until we get a bit more time with him in Season 2, as here he's just someone she can relate to. But also unfucking fortunately, even though he is someone that is very familiar with the White Fang, Blake acts as if she needs to tell him everything, putting aside when she played activist as a kid. Just needless exposition in a show where most of the talking goes nowhere. It eventually leads to both Blake and Sun to take on a White Fang operation, and she attempts something stupid. She takes off the little bow on her head, which was a decent part of her design that didn't match her actual personality well, and attempts to persuade her,
Brothers of the White Fang, why are you aiding this scum?
dumbass. They know what they're doing, and I doubt they care what you have to say. Eventually, the fight breaks off as the authorities arrive and her teammates pick her up. Weiss confronts Blake about having to run away and being gone for 12 hours.
Hello, Editing Scott here. I just wanted to correct a little script error there. It had actually been 2 whole days since Blake had run away, and Weiss had only been looking for her for the past 12 hours. Just wanted to clear that up. Back to the video.
In a somewhat reasonable conversation. But all it means is that Blake is off the hook in terms of a pointless tantrum she threw while making her team worried. There's nothing about her that's interesting. I mean, her guns with little stabby things is probably the most useless I've ever seen. There's no reach. Bullets have been shown to do nothing, and I would question how she could afford using it if they are probably unregistered or stolen. RWBY and Yang have the excuse of having weapons likely from their father's money, and Weiss being rich. I don't think it would be too unlikely to say that her weapons are probably stolen and or modified. Not that the show would give a shit about having such an important detail like that. But something to call out is that Blake ran away from Adam because she didn't trust him as a leader if the black trailer is anything to go by. Why is it that Blake never questions the youthful inexperience of RWBY as a leader? I would think Blake would have trouble interacting with humans for extensive periods of time, given how much she screams about how much she hates them mistreating her kind. Because her little outburst could have happened much earlier, while giving RWBY something to work on in terms of knowing and building trust between her teammates, something Blake would have little of. But no. She's just fine working with them, and Blake herself never objects to the idea of working with Weiss, which could have been established the day they were assigned together. Blake is the perfect tool to embody a lot that is wrong with the show in terms of how little they actually put into the show. Nobody talks like they know each other. Characters don't interact much with one another. There isn't friction or heat, let alone any conflict. Oh, and the backstories constitute as exposition instead of a perspective into why they are who they are. A little experiment. What do you get if you remove the fact Blake is a cat? Give it a minute. If you guess nothing, you would only be half right. The other half of her character would be that of pure cowardice and a lack of empathy. She does not relate to anyone in this show aside from Sun and a smaller character named Velvet, who gets bullied once. At no point does Blake ever try to help her, just scowling at her mistreatment, then doing anything about it since she's a coward with nothing to gain doing so. There is this facade of being oh so mysterious, reading into books we can't read. But at the end of the day, I cannot understand why they think she's a good character when there are a near infinite number of catgirls out there that have more redeeming qualities and less political baggage by comparison. Which brings us to Best Girl, Weiss.
And quite frankly, I deserve better.
I'm not kidding when I say she is, because unlike the rest of the cast, she has something the rest are completely devoid of: development. Weiss Schnee is probably one of the decent characters in the show, because not only is she abrasive with just about everyone, she has tangible character traits. She is a flawed character with discernible challenges in both her attitude and worldview. We also get an idea of where she comes from, something I cannot express for the rest, as their backgrounds are given inadequate attention in future seasons. Her story is that, though a rich kid, her family company often waged war with the Faunus. Even if we never see the supposed war, we do have a connected story from Blake's trailer where some shipments of her father's company was attacked by the White Fang. Being the next successor of the company, she attends Beacon to become a huntress. She hopes to escape the strict responsibilities and expectations set by her father, hopefully leading her own team. Granted, that idea gets struck down pretty quickly when it is RWBY who becomes the leader of the team. She's the first and only character to question RWBY's leadership and have issues, even if Weiss just wants to lead. She gets humbled by her teacher and eventually forms a somewhat stable friendship with RWBY, the only friendship in the show that actually sticks around after the fact. However, they fumble the aspect of Weiss and Blake's predicaments being opposite to one another. Mostly because it's Blake. They don't let the two really interact much this season, or any after that I can remember. Even though Weiss is 100% in the right in both how she argues and providing something personal that she is fully aware of. Whereas with Blake, she lashes out of ignorance and a bias that prevents her from fully forming any arguments. Doesn't help either that we never see Blake herself ever discriminated against or have much trouble with life as everyone is indifferent to her. Which would be the opposite circumstance of Weiss, whose time on the screen doesn't feel as atrocious by comparison. Most of her scenes are significant or amusing in some sense, since they actually do things with her character. But unfortunately, she is in a show that is barren of anything worthwhile and being managed by some incredibly inexperienced writers. There is also the fact that she is the one and only exception where her powers were genetic, while everyone else were apparently random chance, which I am in disbelief. It is not something I'm too invested in, as they don't have any concrete ideas on their limits or strengths.
Weiss's ability is to summon symbols that either summon monsters or cause a few additional effects, such as holding something in place or making someone like herself move even faster. A very versatile power that honestly makes her one of the most capable fighters and why she could have been the leader of the group. She could coordinate the team and attack in sync or off sync to demolish her enemies. But as far as the show uses it, she has used it to help defeat a giant bird, and that's about it. As for any other interests, she really looks up to Pyrrha and is kind of obsessed with the idea of working together with her in some manner. Though this sort of connection is rarely touched upon, especially with what happens later. As far as weapons go, she probably has the most useful since it is a poking weapon mixed with a magnum of sorts. Probably one of the slightly more logical combos, but frankly the very idea of mixing guns and swords in the manner it has been executed would not last long if any of the writers knew how to treat their guns. Otherwise, that is about everything I have to say regarding the 4 main leads, which leaves us with the side characters.
How dare you!
My point exactly.
I am going to blitz through this as fast as I functionally can. Goodwitch is the best hoe. Osmond has no skin. John makes me yawn. Nora leaves a negative. Lai Ren is not really there. And I will be sparing red melons this season. That's it. What do you mean I have to explain myself? Fine. I'll keep it brief. Glinda Goodwitch is probably the most underutilized supporting character, which is a pity considering how good her design is. I would think she would aid in educating the rookies, especially with RWBY, given how strict she is. Ozpin has nothing to offer outside of a few small speeches that leave little to the imagination in terms of what he is supposed to be. There isn't really much to work with for this season nor season 2, so much like Pyrrha, who I will also leave be until the end of season 3. John, on the other hand, is a doofus, which you would think would make him a likable character, but falls short on his ass. For some reason, they felt it necessary to drag on the fact that he came into the academy by forging his papers. Aside from being bullied, you would think they would get Ozpin involved by simply attempting to report his papers, but they don't. Otherwise, his personality is partially based off of Sokka from Avatar The Last Airbender, and mirrors some of his traits. But likability is not one of them.
Pyrrha, I know I'm going through a hard time right now, but I'm not that depressed. I can always be a farmer or something.
As far as I see it, he is inoffensive this season, as will be the case with Nora and Ren. The two are clearly a couple, but it doesn't become official until roughly 7 seasons later. They are sort of opposites, with Nora being a little everywhere and Ren staying in his place. As a whole, this team offers nothing to contrast Team RWBY or any others that we should care about. The other 2 hunters have nothing to comment on either, since their role is quite small. But Oobleck will have something tangible in the next season, at least. Now, the antagonist Roman has at least something going on, but outside of being a functioning villain, he leaves an impression of hope that the series will do something. They never figure that out. Aside from taking notes from A Clockwork Orange, his vocal performance is what keeps him memorable with probably the cleanest design.
Shh, calm down. We're not here for your money. So, why don't you animals try to pick up the pace? Oh, hello, Red! Isn't it past your bedtime?
And that covers just about every significant character in this season. We are left with what is barren in terms of characters and dynamics. It isn't deep, and there leaves a lot to be desired considering just how quickly the writers are to forget or drop aspects of a character in favor of a joke or something else. So, if you've made it this far, firstly, thank you. Secondly, I am not sure when I'll be getting back into talking about Season 2. So in the meantime, I will be working on other projects and taking a quick look at how a rewrite by Celtic Phoenix holds up by comparison. I think it will be a lot of fun to compare considering how much time has passed since its making and where I think he could have cleaned up his own work. Until next time, remember to take care of yourself. Good night. Good night.